Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about one of the reasons why it's so critical that Dungeons and Dragons is preserved and protected, and that Dungeons and Dragons Sentinels, people who have gone beyond Dungeons and Dragons, that really have progressed beyond dungeon mastering, continue to dungeon master, but have added additional duties, right, to what they do. Specifically protecting Dungeons and Dragons. So what I want to talk about today is why is it so critical that Dungeons and Dragons has to be preserved? Because now we're in a time where there's open conversation that Dungeons and Dragons is not needed, and the OSR and the OGLers and the orcs are saying we can pick up the slack, right? Now, we've already seen this in America, right? The agnostics and the atheists came for the church, right? And they defeated the church and closed thousands of churches all over the country, right? And then as soon as that happened, everybody's like, wait a second, weren't the churches doing a lot to empty out the orphanages? Weren't they setting up a whole bunch of hospitals? Didn't they have a whole bunch of soup kitchens? And we shut them down, and the atheists and the agnostics did not surpass them. They literally did what looks like nothing, right? I don't see any new atheist agnostic churches. I don't see a bunch of atheists and agnostics emptying the orphanages, right? I don't see atheist agnostic soup kitchens. What happened, right? So we all agreed to shut something down that was delivering functionality, that was delivering benefit, that was delivering advantage, and we all just agreed to shut it down before we got the replacement. So I don't want to see this happen on Dungeons & Dragons. This is ridiculous, right? And so I want to walk you there to give you a reason why. I'll tell you right now, there's 20 reasons in my head. Today I'm just going to give you one, right? One reason why why we cannot allow the OGLers, the OSRs, and the orcs to win, and for them to deliver on their promise that they shouted thousands of times on Twitter, right? This isn't me making something up. D&D Be Gone was a real hashtag, right? And a real promise to end Dungeons and Dragons forever, okay? So we need to protect it, right? So why? Why do we need to protect it? Well, here's my supposition. I say that Dungeons and Dragons does what OSE and DCC and Worlds Without Number and White Box and Five Torches Deep and RuneQuest all promise to do, but don't, right? Which is lead American culture in massively important cultural experiments and conversations by decades. So I am saying that Dungeons and Dragons is actually leading American culture by decades by fundamentally running social cultural experiments in IRL through abstract IRL modeling, okay? And so let me give you an example of this, right? So in the 80s and the 90s, we started to have a conversation, right? The vast majority we literally had firemen, right? And when you would ask a kid, when they were young, they'd be like, I want to be a doctor. I want to be a fireman, right? Doctor wasn't gendered. Fireman was very gendered. Nobody was like, I want to be a firewoman, because firewoman literally wasn't a thing before the 70s and 60s. There might have been exceptions, but at the macro level, at the 51% level, people said fireman. They were like, hey, I want to be a fireman, right? And there was this open conversation then, right, which was wrong. And they were like, well, you can't be a firewoman because you can't, average man's 180 pounds is 25% of its muscle. They're going to pick up a person or 3 kids and haul them out of the burning building, right? A woman is average 140 pounds, 15% muscle. Those numbers right off the top of my head. You can adjust them however you wish. I think you see where my point's going. And I'm saying this was the conversation at the time. And again, if you think any of this is wrong, if you think any of this is correct, needs to be connected, I invite correction. Get in the comments, send me your data, right? I'm more than willing to look at it, right? All right, so people were like, yeah, fireman is a gendered occupation, right? And it's based on, men are stronger and women are weaker physically, right? And that was a very dated, antiquated, these are incredibly dated, antiquated points in the conversation, because women were like, all jobs should be open to women, right? we bring something to the table, and you can't take one data point and just take us off the board, right? And so in the 80s and the 90s, these conversations started to happen in IRL in America. When did these conversations happen in D&D? 1974, a decade before, 2 decades before, right? So 1974 rolls up, and like immediately, right? Like at the table, guys were like, wait, I get to, and most of them were guys. There were a few women there, right? But guys and gals who were playing Dungeons & Dragons were like, okay, so you're saying I'm not just a token on, I'm like, there's not just one token representing eight troops in a war band. You're talking about I get to play the actual soldier, and Gary Gygax, the actual fighter, and Gary Gygax's like, yeah, you do, right? And they're like, well, and so if it's just one fighter, like, I could say he eats mutton and he drinks milk and he never gets mead. Yeah, that's right. That's right. You're going to craft this person, and their identity is distinct from my identity. And then I drop into that identity, and I actually say the things that soldier would say, that fighter would say. And Gary's like, yeah, that's right. And they're like, what? So now I'm not just one person, I'm 100 people, and I can make as many people as I want, and that's why there was explosive growth on Dungeons & Dragons. But it took about 10 minutes at the table before one dude was like, what if my fighter's female? And they're like, well, you're a man. Like, and so this conversation started, right? And the other players are like, dude, you can't play a woman, you're a man, right? And he's like, well, wait a second, Bob, you don't like lamb, you don't eat lamb. In fact, you're a vegetarian, but your barbarian eats nothing but mutton and mead, right? So if you can choose to be a person who eats mutton and mead and you're a vegetarian in real life, why can't I choose to be a woman, to have a barbarian woman in Dungeons & Dragons? Why isn't that dial turnable? And they're like, oh my gosh, you're right, Bob. You can be a woman. Okay. We're like, and so in 1974, Dungeons & Dragons was having conversations and running the experiments that America was reaching in 1984 and 1994, and frankly, that we're still going to be having in 2024, right? But the value is, and here's the thing, these conversations are absolutely 100% not happening on OSC and Pathfinder because they're retro clone junk, right? Like, they don't break any ground in cultural conversation. They literally are just turning the dials on. Oh, and a longbow does D6. Name one cultural innovation that any retro clone has ever brought forward. You're not going to be able to, and the reason why is they're massively regressive, right? Like, whereas Dungeons & Dragons from 1974 has been massively progressive, right? And so in 1974, Gary Gygax is like, let's start a conversation about gender fluidity, right? And then in 1986, Gary Gygax, why don't I make TSR the most progressive tabletop role-playing game in the world? And the female and the CEO of Dungeons & Dragons and TSR is going to be female. Like a decade before, where in literally almost in 2024, 50 years later, or actually, from 86 to 2024, you're talking, it's over we're talking around 3-4 decades. We still have companies who are like, we don't have the right amount of females on the board, right? Like, so Dungeons & Dragons is literally decades or half a century ahead in progressiveness and is leading America in very real, very valuable cultural conversations, and the retro clone junk is leading in nothing, right? So if you replace, right, this treasure of Dungeons & Dragons with this trash of Pathfinder, right, the world loses. This is what I'm telling you. The world loses. You can't do it, okay? You cannot, I'm not saying, and here's the thing, no one should say Pathfinder be gone. Just like, let's put Pathfinder where it belongs, right? If you're some sad sack who wants to, fiddle with numbers and worry about if it's a D6 or a D8 for a longbow, right? And you want to regressively take out cultural conversation, then Pathfinder's for you, right? Like, and I would be okay with that if Pathfinder hadn't come to literally, in my humble opinion, destroy Dungeons and Dragons by embracing D&D Be Gone. And a lot of Pathfinder, I think Pathfinder community members at virtually every level were using that hashtag, and so that's the point. You cannot replace treasure with trash, and this is just one reason why. Every word of that is my humble opinion. I'm eager to hear your humble opinion, and if you have any of the data, like what is the actual, like how much does a man weigh, what percentage muscle, how much can an average man lift versus an average woman lift, right? And actually, I don't even know if we need that, because that was the entire point of the conversation when we were like, it doesn't matter if we lift the same amount or not. You can't just take a job and say we can't have it, right? Which is completely, that seems a very reasonable approach, right? So all that's my humble opinion. But as always, and I stated some things here. All of it's my opinion, but I always invite correction. I want to have the right conversation, right? So if you have data that I don't have, please bring it forward. Please consider subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.